Okay, Juanita, I'd like to start by thanking you today for being part of the Global Feminisms Project. We're going to talk for about an hour and a half today about several topics. I'll ask you first about your personal history. I'd love to hear the story of your background as well as the work you've done and some of your thoughts and insights about the women's movement in Nicaragua. And then we'll end with any connections you see in the autonomous movement and other activist groups in Nicaragua as well as in other countries.
And some of your thoughts and insights about the women's movement in Nicaragua.
Y también tus perspectivas sobre el movimiento aquí en Nicaragua.
And then we'll end with any connections you see with autonomous movement and other activist groups in Nicaragua as well as in other countries.
Y vamos a terminar mirando las conexiones que hay con otros grupos autónomos, tanto aquí en Nicaragua como al exterior.
And I know, Juanita, you've become a spokesperson for the movement and you've spent a lot of time talking about the movement. But today, I'd like you to actually talk about your own personal history. Tell me some things about your early years, your childhood, what kind of family you grew up in, some things that you remember from when you were young.
Tell me some things about your early years, your childhood, what kind of family you grew up in, some things that you remember from when you were young.
Dime algunas cosas sobre tu niñez, sobre tu familia, de memorias que tienes de cuando eras niña.
Well, I'm Juanita Jiménez. I was born in the city of Masaya, which is a city about 35 kilometers from Nicaragua's capital, in a very humble barrio that is like the, it's called Países Bajos. And it's kind of between, we'll say, between the indigenous barrio of Monimbo and the rest of the city of Masaya. In my childhood, well, I kind of have a dual origins. On my mother's side, she's from a very humble family of artisans in Masaya. My grandmother is indigenous. She's from the original settlers of the area of Monimbo. And on my father's side, well, my father was a man from, from the city's oligarchy. And he was a widower who fell in love with my mother when she was very young. And from that union, he had 3 more children. So on my father's side, that was they're a family with much more economic resources. And I think that what impacted me most from my childhood was the inequality, being able to see and live 2 different realities. The reality of my maternal family, very humble people with lots of limitations, and the reality of my father's family with a lot of money, with a lot of land, with many resources, a lot of abundance. And this was a contradiction in my own life at a very young age. I think this had a very important impact in my life. Since I was a girl, well, my mom handled my care and upbringing, and this made me feel a part of that poor barrio. And I was able to interact with with that community, with the boys and girls of the community. Although my studies, because I was the daughter of this man, well, they guaranteed that I study at a private school there in Masaya. And so this connected me to families with more money in Masaya. So then, this is me. Well, a life full of contradictions from a very young age, and in a city that is also very genuine, because it's a city that is characterized by being very dynamic, a city of artisans, where half of the population still conserves the culture of the ancestral communities. And this combination, well, made me not disassociate myself ever from the reality of Nicaragua and the reality of this country, which is a country full of contradictions. Because of my age, well, I had the possibility of, during my childhood, I was born in 1967, And as a young girl, I still have memories of what the Somoza dictatorship was like. And I lived through the revolutionary insurrection, starting from the Monimbo barrio in Masaya, and to see the struggle of those communities that were the least protected and of people yearning for freedom and looking for a project of equality for all citizens. And in this context, I had to live through this whole revolutionary struggle in which members of my mother's family participated. I also saw what the inequality of Somoza entailed, right? Because my father's family was supportive of Somoza, and they were forced to flee the country. And in this sense, my family was divided. One part of it, which was expelled from the country for being people that yielded to the Somoza project, right? And my mother's family, who are revolutionaries, people who fought during the insurrection and who are leaders, or who established themselves as leaders in the context, during the course of the revolution. I was 12 years old during the anti-Somoza fight and the triumph of the Sandinista revolution. And in my childhood, because of this identity with my mother's family, I gave up being in a private school, and I decided to enter a public school. So for my secondary school studies, I went to a public institute, and that's where I entered into a program for student leaders. And through this youth group, I participated in the revolutionary process of the 80s. I mean, I have a history of leadership, starting with the student groups in the Sandinista group, the Sandinista youth in that context. And later, well, I worked after I graduated as a lawyer, I worked in the courts at the end of the 80s, in the military courts. And when I was 22 years old, I became a mother. I mean, with the peculiarity that I had always dreamed that if I had children, I didn't want it to be in the context of war, which was so hard. I lived through the war, the revolution, also what was the counter-revolution in that context and the contradictions that it invoked. And it also gave me a perspective on life, on justice, on what people aspire to, and how many times these projects aren't able to culminate in the improvement for the majority. And my daughter had the luck of being born exactly in 1990, July 18th, 1990. And she was born then in this post-war context, when the country was beginning a peace-building process.
Juanita, can I ask you to back up and tell me a little bit about your experience when you were participating in the Sandinista activity?
Podemos retroceder un poco y hablar un poco de tu participación en la revolución sandinista o con los sandinistas.
Yes, I was saying that I was already hearing, during my studies. I was 12 years old in 1979 when the revolution triumphed. So I was ready for secondary school, the high school. And then when I left, since I decided not to continue in private schools and I decided to go to a public school, because in that context, I identified with the poor. Because my mother's family were artisans, they were poor. And in this context, I stood out as a student leader. I don't know if it's because of my personality, because I'd always liked to say what I think. I've always liked solving problems, large or small. And as a student within the context of the revolution, I think I was able to maximize my capacity of leadership or my intentions to change things from my own perspective, despite being very young. So from a very young age, I was at the front of the groups that the student movements organized to increase production. I led the youth battalions in my region, in Masaya, in what was the 4th region, to go harvest cotton. because in Masaya, in the higher altitude area around Masaya, there was a lot of cotton production. So we would go there so that this crop would not be lost. Well, we would go and harvest the cotton crop. And in the region, it also had coffee plantations, and there was also a deficit of labor to harvest the coffee. So in that context, the students took it upon themselves to do the harvesting. I mean, because of my age, they didn't accept me as a literacy tutor. And, this is something that really made me suffer because I really wanted to participate and teach people to read. But I was just coming out of primary school, so I wasn't in the right age to be able to go and teach literacy skills. So since I couldn't be involved in the literacy campaign in the 80s, well, I became assistant to the literacy teacher in my barrio. So then in my house, it was a house where they taught literacy skills to those in the barrio. In particular, the majority were women. They were about 20 or 22 women, men and women from my barrio who learned to read and write in the barrio. So I helped the official literacy teacher, and I supported him in every aspect of the literacy. I mean, I'm not officially registered as a brigadier in that context, but I did participate in my own way, pretty much still as a child, in the literacy brigades of the 80s. And as I told you, I was mobilized during the harvest season. I participated in many events. I also received military training in the context of combat. Well, women, we also had to learn to use the weapons, and I went when I was really young. I also participated in that process. I was mobilized in war zones, picking coffee. This was a very difficult experience because it meant living very close to the war and what that implies, to be in a process of war. And I also had, I had to say goodbye to some very young friends of mine who were going to the war. Some went voluntarily, but later, when the war heightened, well, others were forced to go. And in those contradictions, they also impacted my life too, developing in me a sense of justice in my life, because I don't think anybody can be forced to do what they don't want to do. I mean, freedom should be wide enough so that every person can decide what to participate in and what to build towards or construct, and in what things not to participate. And for me, it was very hard when they started forceful recruitment in Masaya. And it coincided with a one-year absence because as a student leader in the revolution, I was sent to Cuba to study, to prepare me ideologically. And then upon my return from Cuba in 1986, I discovered that the youth were no longer going voluntarily. They were refusing to go to war. The mothers didn't want their children to die, and I learned about the forced recruitment. And in that context, Monimbo, which had been a very strategic barrio in the fight against Somoza, when I returned in 1986, Monimbo was now against the revolution. This was a very tough reality for me to understand because, well, one asks what happened. And what happened is that, well, the project, which was being sold as a project in favor of the majority, but in the context of the war, the intention of the revolution quickly became sidetracked, and the population felt that they were being forced into a situation that the people didn't agree with. So, Monimbo, a barrio, as I told you, an indigenous barrio, well, it rebelled also against this other type of oppression. And for me, this was very, very difficult because of the ideas and because I believed in the revolutionary process. But it also gave me lots of lessons about what freedom means and what oppression is, and also what a dictatorship is. I mean, if this town resisted Somoza's dictatorship, it was also resisting a military dictatorship that was, in that context, was forcing people to go and defend the revolution. So then this also gave me a very important life experience.
And you said your daughter was born in 1990 at the time of the electoral defeat.
año 90, el año de la pérdida de las elecciones.
Yes, well, loss for some, but it was also a triumph for the others who were the majority. It's been hard for me to learn this. Now, many years later, I've realized this. For those of us who were betting on the revolutionary project, we lived it through a terrible loss. But the truth is that for the majority of Nicaragua, they lived it as a victory, right? To be able to achieve a peaceful country and free itself from the war, which was very difficult. I didn't want my daughter to be born into war. And well, it was by chance. The truth is that I didn't plan it, but it turned out that my daughter was born during the peace process. And this also gave me a lot to think about and a lot of inspiration also, particularly because of her. Well, the need that she also deserves a better world. She deserves a country where we can all really live together without exclusions.
And what kind of activities did you start to get involved in the early 90s?
¿Y a qué tipo de actividades te involucraste en el año 90?
No, in 90, particularly because of the birth of my daughter, and I was still officially within the structure of the army, because I was part of the military courts that had broad authority. Well, they could process common crimes there, military crimes, because they were courts that had a very, very broad scope. So then it wasn't until 92 when I officially left the military structure and began to work independently as a lawyer. I had the peculiarity of, well, in that context, my husband was named judge of a city in Nicaragua that is in the center. It's Huaco. And in this city, well, there was the Ixchen Women's Center is there, which is a women's organization founded, that also came out of the structure of the Amanda Espinosa women's movement. And they were looking for a lawyer to help accompany women who were victims of violence or cases related to violence. So I accepted that job. First, because, I was arriving in a town that, well, it seemed to me that I was underutilized only as an independent lawyer or a stay-at-home mom. So then I saw that as a motivation. In some way I had to help people. So in this organization, I found a way of helping people, and particularly women. In the military courts, I had already had experience for the different ways in which the judicial system treats women. So I was more or less aware of the inequality within the scope of justice. So arriving at Ixchen was like the opportunity to work to improve those injustices. I don't know where I got that inspiration from, but I think that it's part of what marked my life from a very early on. The whole issue of inequality and the difficulties I saw because of those contradictions that I told you about within my own family. So I got started right there in Huaco, and in a short time, I was already taking cases as a lawyer, and well, I stood out for really doing justice and representing cases of violence, of sexual abuse, cases of alimony, but also some cases of social injustices that existed in that town. For example, it's a town that has a very large territorial reach. There's a lot of ranchers or farmers there, and many people are stripped of their land in very unjust ways. For example, because they didn't have access to a loan, so they would borrow from someone and then ended up having their land taken away. And women were victims of this as well. So then aside from the violence that was strictly conjugal violence or sexual violence, I also became interested in this other type of injustice, and I started to win civil cases, penal cases, and this also made me well known as a lawyer in that city, as a lawyer that worked not only for the poor and for the women, but, I ended up standing out. I think that was like my first encounter with feminism, because it was through this organization that I participated in educative and reflective processes and studies of feminism.
And who was
And who was organizing those workshops or those studies on feminism?
Talleres sobre feminismo.
Well, Ixchen Women's Center has within its philosophy, its philosophical base has always been feminism. So they organized here in Managua, along with people from its affiliates, like in Huaco, they organized workshops. So they even had women go through a series of workshops about self-esteem, about recognition of violence. So there was a whole program. There was a strong investment on the educational side at this organization. Today it's a little bit less, but in that context it was very strong, because the emphasis was to pay attention not just within the scope of justice, but also within sexual and reproductive rights. And then in that, as an organization, they constantly had educational programs, and I began participating in those programs. But for me, like I said, for always standing out, I was always doing analyses from a legal perspective and of things that should be just, of how the lay should be applied. I mean, we're talking about 93, when there weren't special laws. We had older laws. But nonetheless, in the scope of those laws that we had, I was able to bring justice in favor of women, despite all the difficulties that existed in the decision makers, in the judiciary system. At that time, there weren't any women-focused police stations, and they would treat them very badly, and they would come out of there beaten up. So then I took that fight, because I said it doesn't matter whether it was the husband. I mean, this is a woman who was beaten. The law establishes it's a crime, and the aggressor must be sanctioned. Of course, I also had the strength of knowledge of being in military courts, right, from working with judicial officials. And this may have given my demands more strength. I think this might have been why I stood out in that context. And later, I was asked if I could, since I returned to Managua. So they offered me a position in Managua. And in Managua, it was different, because then here with Ixchen Managua, I had the opportunity to participate more directly in the process of creating the network of Women Against Violence, and in all the processes of creating the special units, like the police stations. That's to say, the first police station, I worked in one of the police stations because I was one of the lawyers in Ixchen of that district. So the first police station, the first commission, I had the luck of participating in this process of starting to coordinate with the police authorities. And later, I was practicing.
And what year was that you started to organize the women's police precincts?
The stations were founded in 93. The first station was created in Managua's 5th district. So in that year, I was already in Managua. So then I participated in this process as part of the Ixchen organization. And I'd say I think that was where I became more involved in the feminist movement, and also deepened my theoretical understanding of feminism. But in daily practice, I think I'd say I always had this vocation or calling for justice when it comes to inequalities. And to me, gender inequality is the cruelest form in society, because even though there are institutions, even though there are laws, there is still that mentality. They still don't accept women as equal. And these are strong cultural barriers, and you have to fight against them, using litigation, for example, or through political action. So I worked as a lawyer with Ixchen for almost 15 years in Managua, directly taking cases. I mean, I can credit on my resume that I was the first person to win a case for psychological damage. So it could be perceived as absurd, but if the law, well, they had reformed the law and psychological form had been included, so I said, well, there's a law and it has to be upheld. So then the judges wanted to align themselves that there wasn't a precedence, but well, yes, for the new law establishes that it could be processed in the same manner as a case due to physical harm. So then I was the first to press charges, the first accusation for psychological damages. I think it also served to take a breath and, well, to encourage women to report this other type of harm, which is often invisible, but many times it's crueler. And then my contribution in this was recognized. My contribution, it was just easier for me being here in Managua. And I actively participated in the network of Women Against Violence. And even I was being in Ixchen, I was a delegate at the network of women. And I was elected to participate in the technical committees that were the projects for the police stations. And to participate, I mean, I was elected by the Network's Assembly to be one of the delegates on the commission that fights against the National Commission for the Fight Against Violence. And I participated because of my technical knowledge of the processes to create awareness among the justice officials. And this pushed me to participate in a series, to work on a series of training processes with all the judges and prosecutors and police officers. And because of the same, this mandate from the network, well, in the scope of dialogue with the government, I have participated in putting together manuals for all that those programs do. What exists as far as protocols, manuals for survivors of violence, and what little has progressed at the national level. Well, even though it's not being upheld, but the programs on violence, the National Plan Against Violence, I have participated in all of that along with some colleagues. In the network, I was in the position of executive at the beginning, and later with the change in the structure, I ended up in the coordinating commission of the network. There I was elected to be responsible in the area of political participation. And so from my involvement in the process of political participation and the processes of reforming the laws and all the processes that the movement has been involved in.
Were there major issues or cases that stood out for you that you worked on while you were with the network?
Yes, I always took specific cases. I mean, in cases of sexual abuse or of sexual violence, and in my opinion, I think that only a few cases were lost, right? I don't have a complete list of all the cases that I took, but I pressed charges directly, and so then I represented in a context when there still wasn't a public defense, when the Office of the District Attorney didn't exist. So the victims either arrived alone or were accompanied, and if it was possible, through the centers for women. So in Managua, I helped many cases of sexual violence and conjugal violence that led to injuries and death threats. The threats were a crime that were almost never punished when they were dealing with partners or spouses, right? But I made it happen. I mean, a death threat is just as serious, whether it comes from a neighbor or from a spouse. It should be even more serious. Later, with the reforms to the penal code, it was possible for these crimes to have a more specialized treatment. There are very sad cases of sexual violence directed to little girls. I think those are the cases that have impacted me most because, sexual abuse is, I believe, one of the cruelest types of violence because they mark you for life. And even though you learn to survive, well, I mean, it obviously marks your life and your private sphere and your development. So when you're a little girl, in the cases that I worked on, I think that many of them who are now grown women, but well, I know it wasn't easy, surviving. And it's true that I contributed to a sense of justice because the aggressors were convicted, but I think there's still a lot to do so that these women, the system in general or society in general really can open itself up to guarantee better conditions and assimilation or rehabilitation processes after such a serious wound. Other cases that were also very difficult, like sexual abuse cases that are cases of incest because they involve the fathers or the grandfathers. These kind of cases were also very difficult for me to represent. They were all indicted, but, well, the processes, well, they were, I mean, it was like they say sometimes, and still currently they still say this, there's a lot of stigma towards the victim, a lot of blame. And it's very difficult for the families, too. I mean, I've seen how families confront it. They go between wanting to believe the victim and wanting to believe the aggressor. And in the end, those are ways of denying the violence and the abuse. Sometimes denying means not believing, not necessarily because they don't agree or they aren't shaken up. Many family members have denied it, or sometimes even the mothers of the victims when they're young or adolescents. But those, I think, are mechanisms they use to overcome those damages. So then in my life, I have these kind of experiences, and well, I think that they've given me the wisdom to understand some very emblematic cases.
Juanita,
Did you specifically ever experience any threats or consequences for any positions you took on certain issues or cases? And have you received any specific threats because of your perspective on any cases?
Well, not before. I mean, the only statement that has been really direct has been in the context of the current government. I mean, I have been subjected to 2 investigations with the intent of criminalizing me. The first for the crime of abortion, right? I'm part of the list of 9 feminists who were accused of illicit association to commit a criminal offense and for aiding and abetting the crime of abortion.
Can you tell me about what that experience was like for you?
Can you tell me about what that experience was like for you personally?
Well, it was a very difficult experience because, well, I think that Nicaragua's feminist movement, right, and women in general in Nicaragua have been very strong. That is to say, we've been very strong in our fights and our battles. But, I mean, it's not the same when you're leading a struggle as when you're defending yourself because of this struggle. Because this has a very negative impact for women. So for me personally, it was hard because it didn't only put us at risk of losing our individual freedom and the possibility of being imprisoned. That's hard, right? For someone who normally, I mean, you are in search of justice, and soon you feel that that mechanism for justice is being used against you. And this questions the whole process that, well, in a country that supposedly should be democratic, where the authorities should respect the laws. But it's a bad example, for women, and it also has a negative effect in society, and, well, particularly ultimately it exacerbates machismo because if, let's say, an authority or the powers of the justice system don't respect rights and run over women who defend rights, then an aggressor in his house, he feels he has the liberty to attack because the law won't do anything. So for me, in this context, well, the political persecution that we have spoken against internationally, I mean, more than the individual risk, it also puts Nicaraguan women at risk. And the other is because of crimes, right? That they are crimes that it's in the case of abortion because we were accused of aiding and abetting abortion because we fought for the restoration of therapeutic abortion. So that's absurd because then you're struggling to defend women's lives because taking away therapeutic abortion means that you are now denying the possibilities of terminating a pregnancy to save your life. In that case, that cannot be questioned, but the law went backwards and criminalized it. So then to accuse us for trying to reestablish this right or this section of the law so that women can save their own lives and that they want to criminalize you for this, then, it's really hard. It's very negative for society. Well, it takes us back many years on the advances that termination of pregnancy was allowed. Nicaragua entered into a process of modernizing the penal codes, supposedly with the idea of making them more humanistic, with more guarantees. And in this process of debate, they began to discuss the complete criminalization of abortion. The arguments have never really been about legal issues. Rather, they were more religious and guided in particular, by leaders of the Catholic Church. And Nicaragua is a secular state, so it's not constitutionally ascribed to any official religion, and it's governed by the rule of law. This means that rights and the law prevail above any religious dogma. Nonetheless, in 2006, within the framework of this debate, of this new penal code, the party, which is currently in office, began to negotiate with leaders of the Catholic Church and facilitated an immediate reform to the current code and eliminated the exception for therapeutic abortion from the code. In this context, the Nicaraguan feminist movement began in the first place to fight to keep the elimination from happening. And later, we have been arguing legally and at the national level about the necessity to reinstate this exception into the law. And particularly because we're talking about fundamental rights, the right to life. And this has required a lot of political mobilization from the movement, and all of the Nicaraguan feminists and from other social sections have been involved, such as the medical societies and human rights organizations. So then in 2007, with the current government's arrival to power, and this particular accusation, although it's true that it was presented by a person from an organization connected to the Catholic Church, but it was, and we know that this accusation was drafted, in the office of the current government. So 9 of us feminist women were criminally accused for illicit association to commit a crime and for apology of the crime of abortion. And the actions they included in this accusation were any and all political action that the women's movement have made to make therapeutic abortion legal again. So, if the intention is to punish your constitutional right of freedom of expression, because the Constitution also gives us the right to express ourselves and mobilize ourselves, so then it's like illogical that they try to criminalize political activism. Without a doubt, the intention was clear, right? It was an intention to intimidate the women's movement and also, in particular, to socially discredit it.
And what were you charged with?
Well, they accused us of those crimes.
¿Con cuáles acusaciones? Okay.
9 of you were criminally charged. What was the issue they brought against you?
9 de ustedes, pero ¿cuál era la acusación?
It was for being authors of this crime because the penal code establishes, it's a criminal act. The crime of abortion is punishable. No kind of abortion is permitted in Nicaragua. So then it means that according to this allegation, if we were doing activism in favor of abortion, it was as if we were inciting others to commit this crime, which is absurd because the penal code was used to appeal to the Constitutional Court because, well, the exemption shouldn't be eliminated because it wouldn't only violate the fundamental human rights of Nicaraguan women, but it also would contradict the obligations of the government of Nicaragua to international conventions that protect women's rights. But the intention was to criminalize it, to criminalize the women's movement as part of a general strategy against Nicaraguan civil society on behalf of the current government. But with an emphasis on the movement because it's been a very active movement with a history of relentless struggle, a movement of which part of its leadership declared itself in opposition to the initial candidacy of Daniel Ortega because he's someone who's suspected of abuse for having sexually abused his daughter.
Sexual abuse against
Also, we always said that this accusation was a form of payback because, well, this movement, the leadership in particular, which I was a part of, well, we were the ones who accompanied Soy la America Narvaez's accusation. She's Daniel Ortega's stepdaughter, when she accused him of sexual abuse. And the movement as a whole, to show unity and autonomy, supported those allegations, even though Ortega was the leader of the Sandinista Front, and he had a history that went back all the way to the days of the revolution, as did many of us. So then, in the imagination of the government's party, the feminist leadership is seen as an adversarial position, as a traitor to the Sandinista Front. So once they got to power, it was something like payback to accuse us like this, to make up such things. Nothing came of this accusation, but it meant 2.5 years of investigation with the only intention of intimidating the feminist leaders.
only to kind of break down.
But this accusation happened, and they had this intention of putting us in jail. But it led to national and international activism, and there was also condemnation from different human rights committees. Amnesty International also carried out important activism to prevent the criminalization of the movement and of the leadership.
Sé que alguna de esas acusaciones
Juanita, I know that some of those efforts were to really shut down the movement, but can you say a little bit about how it impacted your own life? How did those criminal charges affect your personal life? Did it have an impact on your daily life?
particular.
Well, it has an impact because it entails risk for, as I told you, the biggest risk was the loss of freedom. Even though we were willing to defend ourselves, and if they jailed us for defending rights, well, we were going to go to jail. This is because our fight is based on conviction, because we are convinced that all women's rights should be respected, from the fundamental ones to other social, economic, and cultural rights. For me, well, the solidarity gave me a lot of strength. The support of women at a national and international level, this gave a lot of legitimacy to my work. But I can't deny that it didn't have an impact on my family, right? Because the family feels at risk that you could be criminalized that you could be detained. I mean, I have a daughter that, well, of course, she wouldn't have liked for her mother to go to jail and I have a mother that, yes, she admires my work, but sometimes, well, I'm her daughter and it hurts her. The threat that I could be imprisoned. So then it does have an impact on the family because, well, for me in general, in my, let's say, in my life as dedicated to feminism, to the feminist struggle, I've had lots of support and a lot of legitimacy because of what I do. So the big contradiction is that all of a sudden, for doing this, something that is correct in the eyes of society, that something with which people identify with, and that they want to criminalize you because of this, well, it's just very contradictory. It's very difficult. So it does have an impact because, I mean, it feels like aside from injustice, I mean, it means confronting power in a very direct way and in a very disproportional way, because the only path we had was for our cause for justice and being conscious that what we did for women's rights, but we were also conscious that within the context of the persecution that was going on and that continues to go on in the country, well, it's really violent. This institutional violence, and it denies any kind of action in the legal environment because the law isn't valid anymore. What's valid is authoritarianism and the intention of using this power against someone who you want to abuse, who you want to eliminate, or who you want to repress or to sanction because you don't like them or simply because they project themselves as someone who is opposed to your ideas or opposed to your government. So it was very difficult for me, but it also gave me a lot of strength and many lessons about the cause and that it's valid despite the risks. And I think that's the main thing. I mean, this case for me I'll tell you, it was a case that was very emblematic because, like I said, it implied for the defenders to start to defend ourselves. But I think that we won the battle, and we won it positively. But we also weakened the image of absolute power that they had, and they wanted to set up in the country, and that I think we feminists also gave them a lesson that in this context, well, I don't think anybody, despite being so behind, despite so much machismo, people aren't willing to give up their freedom, even if this freedom still isn't enough. Isn't enough in the execution of rights, and I think feminism has gone a long way towards this. That's the first. The second one was worse because they invented terrible crimes against us. In the second accusation that I confronted was the accusation against MAM in particular and against Cinco, the Center for Investigation and Communication, of which Sofia Montenegro is the executive director. She's another very important feminist leader. And in that accusation, the intention was very evident that the intention to criminalize the work we did and to halt our struggle. In this accusation, it was indicated that the women's movement was illegal and that we were in an alliance and executing a governmental project that was a first project that we had achieved through the allocation of democratic governance funds. And that what we promoted through this project was for women to exercise their rights as citizens. But and that can be very threatening to formal powers, because if you give women the tools and they begin to see that it's not only their particular rights, but a lot of other rights, their political rights, and that they're so important, such as the right to eat, the right to work. So this implied that there was also a lot of activism from the women around defending democracy. So then I think that those in power didn't like this, particularly this government, and it pressured and structured a new attack against all of civil society, but with an impressive viciousness on the women's movement. In this context, we were also accused of money laundering or triangulación de fondos. Those are crimes that belong to organized crime. And we are a legitimate movement, a movement that is based on a specific struggle, specific activism, working for the common good, particularly women's rights. So then it was absurd, I think, and that it was also a show of power on the part of the government and on the part of the current government of wanting to delegitimize the possibility that you can obtain funds from the cooperation for the development of this activism. This was very perverse and it was very tough because it implied the utilization of authoritarian power in a stronger way, the different divisions of the state, particularly the justice system, and it's very serious. I had to confront the process of arbitrary search warrants to the offices of the autonomous movement. I mean, we had a search warrant that was conducted with, a police display as if they were searching the house of a drug trafficker. And it was very hard for the citizens. But I think also it was like a wake-up call for the Nicaraguan society, and that it wasn't well seen. Even though some sectors don't identify with feminism or the topic of abortion, for example, but an outrage of this kind, which was in 2008, I think the society was very coherent and said, no, this isn't right. And I also think that this gave us a lot of strength to fight from a disadvantage point, because all of the power is against you because of things that at the level of the application of the law criminally are very strong, like being accused of money laundering and triangulación de fondos. Well, they weren't able to carry it out because the intention was simply to run us over, but the cost was high, particularly for those in power, because the level of censorship, the level of national and international condemnation was also very strong. And I think that this really sounded the alarm so people would realize that no authoritarian regime can be positive for the country. Even less so for the Nicaraguan people who have fought so much for freedom and who have fought so hard to find a democratic model through which we can all coexist.
Juanita, can you talk a little bit about how you went from your work with the network at that time to making a decision to start here at the Organization for the Autonomous Movement?
Well, as I said, from working directly, litigating specific cases of different types of violence, I went on to coordinate cases or commissions or spaces in the network of Women Against Violence. And doing that, when I left in this context, particularly after 2003, when there was a very emblematic case here in Nicaragua, which was the case of little Rosita, who was a girl from Costa Rica who became pregnant as a result of sexual abuse. A little immigrant girl from Costa Rica, and there was a debate precisely about therapeutic abortion. So in that year, which was a very difficult year, when I was already in the offices of the Network for Women, I became the spokeswoman of the network because they had to argue on a legal level. And I was elected in this area of political participation in the Women's Network. But at the level of the movement in general, they initiated a process of evaluation of the women's autonomous movement, with the understanding that the autonomous movement included all of us who believed in autonomy and who, since the 1990s, had been working to reclaim the feminist agenda that had been ignored in the 1980s. So then, in that process of reorganization, of evaluating what had happened in the last 10 years, we're talking about 2003, which is when I participated in the Network of Women Against Violence, and I was responsible for the area of political participation at a meeting on compromise of the Women's Autonomous Movement, where we decided that we were going to evaluate this, but we also conducted a series of debates about how we wanted to organize ourselves, how we wanted to strengthen our strategies, how to construct a document, a platform that we could all share within the feminist logic and with two fundamental axes, which are the autonomy and equality for women. So then I participated in this process, and after the process was about 3 years of debate, analysis, and restructuring of the women's autonomous movement, and it concluded in 2006. In 2006, there was a refounding. So on March 8th, 2006, the women's autonomous movement was refounded, and it was decided to give it that it should have a public face. I mean, because it was a movement that included all of us, but it didn't have a specific spokesperson. A movement we all subscribed to, but there wasn't a specific reference for society. So then we decided to create a minimal structure, and within this minimal structure, I was elected. So then I became part of the structure of the women's autonomous movement in about 2000.
Why were you elected?
Well, I understand that they elected me because I had been participating in different processes because of my work in different spaces of organizing the movement. I mean, sometimes they tell me that one of my characteristics is that I like articulating. I believe in collective processes, but they should be truly collective. It shouldn't be that one person decides for the rest. So in the network, in the structure of the network, I wagered a lot in creating the structure that feminists really wanted so much, and that the rest of us resent in patriarchy, this verticalism, this authoritarianism that is reflected in their organizational structure. So creating horizontal structures seems absurd, but, well, it is possible to create mechanisms where we can all make decisions, where we can all decide about a platform for complete action. Then I think that this process, where I have participated and I represented someone else, well, in the final process, I was recognized before my peers, and that's why I was elected in this as part of this structure in the women's autonomous movement. Later, the story is that, well, I left the coordination of the Women's Network, and it coincides with this project that the movement had obtained through those funds for governability, this project of constructing citizenship for women. And in this project, they anticipated funds for a house, to have a physical space that would be a referral point for society, for the media. And since I had just left the network, they offered me that job to be in a paid position and to coordinate this project. And so from there, I engage in executive tasks. So for some of them, it might seem that I'm the executive director, but in the reality, in the structure, I am part of an executive commission of a collective coordinated authority. And the only difference is that I am a full-time paid employee with the projects that we are able to compete for and to obtain from the donors and for cooperation. So then in this context, I have now stayed as an executive to guarantee that there's a spokesperson and to continue strengthening this, from here, to strengthen the coordination of different requests and different organizational forms of the movement.
What are some of the current issues women are facing that the organization is trying to address now?
Well, today, the biggest, I'd say the main challenges is simply the existence of the movement. And from this perspective, you find yourself in a position of resistance or resisting the intentions of, we'll say, the formal political powers of wanting to delegitimize you or of wanting to politically eliminate you. So one of the biggest challenges of the movement is its own subsistence, to continue to keep yourself in a key position. But the other aspect for us is the struggle for democracy. And in this struggle for democracy and institutionality, this is because I think that a person only realizes the risks and values of processes until either when you lose them or when you're at risk of losing them. And I think this is what is happening here in Nicaragua. As I have said, we initiated a peace process in the 90s and wanted to begin to construct a model that wasn't revolutionary in its essence because it had different ideological intersections, but it was projected in the necessity of a democratic model where we could all participate in, but also a democratic model where we could have clear rules and everything and a legal security for all. In that context of peace building, women advanced because if we were constructing democracy for all, then we also demanded democracy for women. And that was what the movement was wagering on. I mean, how to construct institutionalism so that at the formal level, this institutionalism guarantees rights for women. That is the idea. Thinking of it through the logic of the fight against violence, from the logic of the struggle for equality. So we had been advancing in that. With this situation, with the current government that has practically ignored us and suspended the whole process, is when you realize that when you think that what little you thought you had progressed, it turns out that you're at risk of losing it when you lose the institutionalism. And the concrete proof was the loss of the exception for therapeutic abortion. Then when there isn't institutionalism that secures fundamental rights, then this happens. I mean, how is it possible that in 22 days you're able to abolish a law with an exemption that implies the recognition of fundamental rights for women? And with this exemption, well, eliminating this one article, it implied reversing women's legal position 169 years. So for us who believe in equality and believe in democracy, we believe that the current priority is recovering, as I say, the path towards democracy. And in this context, the power of the fight for democracy to position our feminist agenda as one of the interests of the women's movement.
What are some of the strategies that you're using to rescue democracy for women?
We, in our strategic plan, one of the clear strategies has been the construction of citizenship. Citizenship for women. Because there's a big deficit in Nicaragua. I mean, Nicaragua, because of its different contexts, that's to say, the society, even at an educational level, hasn't guaranteed the understanding of their own fundamental rights. Here, people don't even know that, even at the professional level, they don't know the text of the political constitution. So you cannot defend your rights if you don't appropriate those rights. And you're imprisoned in a way by leaders, or you're imprisoned by populism when you don't know that the right to eat or the right to education aren't handouts. They aren't charity, but they're actually fundamental rights that the government has to guarantee to their people. So then this is the strides we're moving toward. I mean, we've achieved, at the different territories, we've been facilitating a lot of information through workshops and forums and debates about what the institutionality of democracy really is. We are distributing in text, that is, we've created this incentive It's a political constitution in a small format, and we call it, the pocket or the purse edition, because we want women to be able to have it, to know what people are talking about when they mention the Constitution, what people are talking about when they mention rights. And they're right there. I mean, it's not that someone is doing you a favor regarding a certain right, but rather that rights are already established there and that you have to understand them in order to defend them. Let's say that this is a fundamental strategy. The other is to promote the whole organizational part, to organize women. I mean, Nicaragua has the characteristic that for adverse context, whether it's the war or national disasters, people are able to come together to improve their environment. So how do we enhance all of those abilities using those same women? I mean, women can lead, yes, but we also want women to be recognized for this leadership capacity from their own potential in their own community. So then to work with women's leadership is another important axis for us. And we've been developing these processes at a territorial level. We have been guaranteeing this throughout the organization.
Juanita, I know you've written an entire book on this, but could you tell us very briefly about the history of the women's autonomous movement?
Sobre ese tema, pero si nos puede dar un breve del movimiento autónomo de las mujeres.
Well, I was telling you that the women's movement in Nicaragua is very big. It has different organizational forms. The autonomous, as a movement currently, is the organizational expression of the feminist movement in general in Nicaragua. And in the analysis of this study that we did for 10 years about the fight in favor of women's rights, well, it was very clear that the movement is very rich. It has a lot of strength. Included is its organizational capacity that it has, and the other is that it is a recognized authority within our own society, despite machismo.
Can you back up and tell us how the movement started?
Well, the movement has its origins in the context of the revolution, with the peculiarity that within this context, let's just let it go by. Look, those things never go down this street. I don't know why today. I mean, they might be boycotting us.
I just throw the ice cream and just shut it.
So she said the movement has its history in the revolution.
Los orígenes vienen de la revolución, decías.
Well, let's say the organizational part. I mean, because the context of the revolution made it easy for people to organize. The difficulty in that context is that you organized, but only around a single model, which belonged to the party of the Sandinista Front, and the logic of mass organizations. So then the Luis Amanda Espinosa movement, for example, which is like the organizational predecessor to the women's movement, it was a movement totally, let's say, within the logic of a mass organization of the Sandinista Front. And despite being a very rich movement, it allowed women to organize. The whole agenda was in function of the agenda of the Sandinista Party, where women's rights were never the priority. It was always said that since we were at war, then later we were going to look into the rights that women were demanding because the whole problem of violence. In the same context of the revolution, there were the conditions to widen the considerations for abortion, for example. Nevertheless, although these problems could have been dealt with within that context, the Sandinista Party said that they needed to wait because this wasn't the right time, and the priority was the war, and the priority was to defend the revolution and to make yourself available to other types of programs that weren't specifically directed to women. But that then, at the organizational level, is where the base is. Then, at the end of the 1980s, there was a process of autonomy or of, let's say, from the women's leadership, there's more influence over the feminist movement. And there was a demand for the particular feminist agenda. And since it never really fit in within the revolutionary model, many leaders of the movement that were organized around the revolution started a process of creating other types of organizations apart from the Luis Amanda Espinosa movement. And they started forming collectives from there. And then in 1992, with the revolution, they held a big meeting that was called the Festival of the 52%. That was what it was called publicly, but behind the scenes, what it was about was a declaration of autonomy and a search for its own identity as a movement. And that's where they begin to talk about the women's autonomous movement, with the logic that autonomy is the principal issue to be able to progress as its own movement, as an indigenous movement, as an independent movement that follows the agenda of its own women. And this implied several political costs, right? Because many leaders were expelled from the party. Others were demonized for ideologically wanting to focus on neoliberal ideas, for example. But undoubtedly, the movement decided to organize in its own way. And this is so strange. Doesn't matter. We can talk over this noise.
Yeah, it's okay. We can take some sound out and keep the voices when we edit it.
They're going to play music, of course. Something's happening in the park. You're not going to be able to turn it off.
Well, we can wait. She said the music's in the park and it's not going to be shut off.
But it's going to be more difficult with the music.
But the music's okay?
Well, you're the experts about that. But it distracts me.
So you were in the middle of telling us about how the movement was becoming autonomous in the early 90s.
92. And starting there in 1992, they decided to take on different organizational forms. There were like two different possibilities. One, which was a little bit more organic, and the other one was through networks. And the majority decided to organize in thematic networks. And that's where the Network of Women Against Violence, the Network of Women for Health, these came out of this. There were like 10 different networks with different topics, different axes, within the platforms of the feminist movement. Others decided to articulate themselves organically in what was the National Feminist Committee, of which Sofia Montenegro was one of the leaders. And, from their logic, beyond the thematic work, they believed it was necessary to work around strengthening the feminist identity within the platform. She does come by.
Would she rather go inside? Because it's only going to keep on going. Ask her if she'd prefer to go inside. We only have about 15 minutes. Do you think we can deal with the noise?
We only have about 15 minutes. Do you think we could deal with the noise?
Solo nos faltan como 15 minutos. ¿Cree que podemos aguantar?
Well, it's up to you guys. It doesn't bother me.
Okay, let's keep going.
I have a hard time following.
Oh, you do?
But no, just till they pass a little bit. Okay. Do you want to? We can.
No, we're not going to buy any today. Could you just not ring the bell? We're recording.
Okay, we're good. Okay, as long as you can do it. We'll just move it through.
Bueno.
Okay. Sorry. So you were telling us about the creation of the autonomous movement after 1992.
Nos decía de la creación del movimiento autónomo después del 92. Puedes seguir. La creación de los líderes.
Well, generally, all of the expressions that were used by feminists and were autonomous of whatever kind of expression, whether it's a party or church or any group with power, this autonomy, and the emphasis was on the autonomy from the Sandinista front. So then we took this on as an autonomous women's movement in its distinct organizational expressions, be that networks, specific organizations or groups or collectives, specifically feminist or women's rights groups. Later, as I was telling you, we were working all these years without any particular structure, not even a little bit. And the work was more about positioning ourselves in terms of specific situations. I mean, positioning ourselves regarding specific cases and positioning ourselves regarding policies projecting negatively on women or fundamentalist positions in the case of the previous government with the topics of abortion or sexual and reproductive rights. So then under this umbrella, the autonomous movement subscribed to all of these organizational expressions. And those who didn't subscribe and felt like, well, like the Luis Amanda Espinosa movement, it has always remained closely aligned to the Sandinista front. So then even if they identify with some of the issues like violence, they won't present themselves in a position against the Sandinista front. But well, this is respected because they are part of the movement, what we call the broad women's movement, in that one person could easily subscribe to the feminist platform, or she can actively subscribe to specific topics in the struggle, and at the end we bring it all together. So, in 1998 there was kind of a fork in the road because, well, Soy la América Narváez's accusation against the leader of the Sandinista Front was in 98. So then in that context of 1998, it was very important for us because it showed the coherence of the movement. It's a movement that, whether we like it or not, it is ideologically its ideological force is aligned with the ideas of the progressive left, we'll say organizationally developed within the revolutionary context. So for it to accuse the leader of the Sandinista Front of sexual abuse wasn't easy. This involved the movement to take a stance. So then I think this was a test of the autonomy of the feminist leadership in Nicaragua, and I think we passed the test because, well, in this context, we decided to support the accusation and to back the accusation and push for justice in the case of Soy la América, and we demanded that Daniel Ortega had to be put through the justice system because if he had committed such a serious crime, then he had to face justice. And in that context, I think the movement came out much stronger and much more legitimate in the eyes of other sectors of society that probably identified with the right or ideologically identified with their faith, and they weren't very close to the movement. But with this position, I think that the movement won legitimacy. And that's how the strength and the autonomy from the Sandinista party was made evident, despite the consequences of the attacks and the outrage that we've gone through in the current situation. But I think that what happened in 1998, well, a period that marked and definitely strengthened what would be the autonomy of the women's movement. As I already explained, the autonomous movement as an organizational space was founded in 2006 because of the particular necessity of having a small organic space and at the same time also strengthening the base, the feminist platform. And that's the organizational expression that we work for. From this from here, from the women's movement. This doesn't delegitimize that the network of Women Against Violence or the regional networks or other parts of the movement that consider themselves feminist and that assume autonomy, they form part of the richness of the movement as a women's movement and as a feminist movement here in Nicaragua. And I think that in the study that I worked on that analysis of the 10-year history of the movement, it was very clear that the movement, despite not needing to have a strategic plan, I mean, we clearly share space within a feminist platform. Its axis of struggle is clearly identified. We'll say its biggest strategy being the fight for equality. The fight against violence is also important, and everything that is involved with the feminist identity, because it's what makes the movement coherent and strong. And perhaps it's seen as a dispersal that would be all that organizational diversity that in the end is it's positive as far as it makes it easy for women to ascribe to different parts of the organization. It doesn't matter if you can be in a community, if you are there connected with other women in a specific organization and you fight for your rights. All of this contributes to the collective feminist identity in Nicaragua.
Juanita, I'd like to ask you to talk about feminism a little bit, but not feminism from the perspective of the movement. Can you tell me what feminism means to you?
Quiero hablar un poco del feminismo, pero no quiero hablar desde la perspectiva del movimiento, sino qué significa el feminismo para ti.
Well, for me, I'll tell you, for me, feminism is an inspiration to fight for equality. Feminism is like a platform for our concrete action, and well, it seems to me that it's let's say the strength of the inspiration for social justice. As I said, I assumed my identity as a feminist in practice in the search for justice for women. But later I realized that this justice, well, it's not going to be complete if there isn't social justice and if society doesn't recognize us women as equal. So in the end, I see it as an inspiration for this fight in favor of equality, for rights, and in favor of justice in general for women.
And are you a feminist?
Now I do consider myself a feminist.
You've talked a lot about the different organizations and networks that are linked together in Nicaragua. Are you also organized with regional networks or feminist organizations in other countries?
Has hablado mucho de los vínculos, o sea, alianzas que tienen con otras organizaciones aquí en Nicaragua, pero también tienen relaciones o alianzas a nivel regional o internacional.
Of course, I mean, feminism in Latin America has strengthened in the last decade. I think that feminism, even though it isn't socially recognized in Latin America, has played an important role in different social changes that have been promoted in the region, from the perspective of the military dictatorships to the peace processes and the search to strengthen democratic institutionalism. In a region where one of its deficits has been the institutionalism and the rule of law. I mean, I don't think the governments have ever, except some countries in the South, but I think that Latin America has suffered from not having a government, well, in the sense of a government that guarantees rights and in the sense that you find solid democratic basis. This also has to do with the deficit of citizenship that I was explaining to you. So then feminism in this context has contributed to strengthening all of these processes that have been developing. So then in Latin America, we are very connected, very connected. We have the possibilities that before, when internet didn't exist, for example, we had been organizing a series of regional meetings that allowed us to physically meet, but also to renew debates, analyses, and value political action or the difficulties on exercising our rights that we women have in the region. And this has also allowed us to strengthen feminism from the point of view of Latin Americans, because it's not the same to be a feminist in our countries that are lacking so much as it is in a country which guarantees and has strong institutionality. So it's harder. So then I think that we have been constructing a feminism through practice and throughout Latin American reality. And since they coincide, it's what brings us together. And that's why I told you that I hadn't measured this relationship, because I've probably met with some women in these events that I've participated in over the years. But when they attacked us, when us Nicaraguan feminists were attacked, well, to see women from other countries firm in their repudiation of Daniel Ortega's visit to their countries throughout the world, but particularly in Latin America, and they repudiated him for attacking us, for attacking feminism, and for wanting to criminalize us, it was very nice for me, because it meant that we are related, and that despite the borders, feminism can, it's not only an abstract solidarity, but also a coherent activism that we share. So then we're very connected, as I said, to feminism. I mean, we have very strong connections with Mexicans and with the South Americans. I think us Central Americans are a little bit closer because of regional issues. And this has allowed us to experiment with different organizational forms at a regional level. And this also projects us towards Europe and towards the United States as a feminism with strong grassroots and with a coherent, very coherent on the level of its proposals. And I think that in this context, where forces that have traditionally been of Latin American leftist nature have gained power, I mean, feminism is like the Achilles heel, because feminism has liberating ideas and it shares a vision for social justice and justice for women, and has been it's controversial and has been very critical of how those governments have been identified as leftist in the region, have used their power. And this also indicates a contribution from feminism about the coherence for alternative models to which we have aspired to for decades, but that there is still so much more to do.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I want to thank you again, Juanita, for your time today and participating with the Global Feminisms Project.
Es un perfecto lugar para terminar, y también quiero agradecerte por tu participación en el proyecto de Feminismo Global.
Well, thank you, because you've allowed me to share my story.
It was an honor to hear your history.
Realmente fue un honor escuchar tu historia.
No, and for me, sometimes I say I've been very privileged that in my 44 years I can have different stories and have a very diverse perspective on life, and that and what this brings is paradigms for women.